So we're finally at the cerebral cortex after leading to it the whole quarter. And we're going to talk about some of the structures of the cerebral cortex and dysfunction of the cerebral cortex. And a lot of the dysfunctions that we've talked about so far obviously are manifested in this part of the brain. So we're going to look at some different disorders of the cerebrum, agnosia, astereognosis, which we talked about stereognosis in the somatosensory system. So astereognosis is where you can't do it. Visual agnosia, audio agnosia, apraxia, dysarthria, and motor perseveration. We're going to look at the locations and functions and disorders of the primary and secondary sensory areas of the cortex, and the locations, functions, and disorders of the motor areas of the cortex. So interesting stuff here. So the cerebral cortex is a huge collection of cell bodies, axons, and dendrites covering the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. The most common type of cortical neurons are granule and pyramidal cells. So granule cells are small interneurons that remain within the cortex. And pyramidal cells sometimes synapse without leaving the cortex, but a lot of them synapse outside of the cerebral cortex. So there are layers of the cerebral cortex, and the neurons in the layers are differentiated by size and connectivity. So do they connect just within their own area, or do they go out to other areas, or they project to other areas, as we say? So in the olfactory and medial temporal cortex, there are 3 layers of cells. In the rest of the cortex, there are 6 layers of cells. I'm not going to expect you to name all the individual layers. And in fact, I'm not even going to talk about them. But you should just know that it's very layered and then very convoluted upon itself. So you have those gyri and sulci, which are the bumps and grooves of the cerebral cortex. That's how we get this big collection of neurons all crumpled into this small little package that we can stick in our cranium. So originally, the cerebral cortex was mapped. We have all the different areas, and you can look at the external physiology or the external structure of the brain, and you can dissect it and look at all the different things, but you can't tell from that what things do. And initially, what they used to do is if someone was undergoing brain surgery, they allowed lots of different people allowed neurosurgeons to stimulate and record from various areas of the cerebral cortex. So one of the original maps that was done is similar to what the graphic is here, and was done by a neurosurgeon named Broca, who mapped a lot of the functional areas of the brain. Brodmann's areas, it's another neurologist. It was in the time when people were naming things after themselves. That doesn't happen as much anymore. But these early neurosurgeons helped us to figure out what areas of the brain are doing what functions. Since then, we've learned a lot more by imaging. Now we have imaging techniques that we can use to investigate brain function without invasive procedures. So you don't have to be undergoing brain surgery and have electrons put in your brain to figure out what is going on in the brain. So you can do some sort of non-invasive stimulus and see what parts of the brain light up on a functional MRI. So that's really useful for finding out more. A lot of the pain theory that has come up has been mapped by functional MRI testing. So each area of the cerebral cortex has a function, and the functions are very localized. So that's one of the reasons why when you have a brain infarction or a stroke, you have specific losses, sensory or motor losses, because it depends on the loss you have depends on the area where the lesion is and the extent of the lesion. So there are 5 categories based on function. The primary sensory cortex discriminates among different intensities and qualities of sensory information. The secondary sensory cortex analyzes that sensation. So it gives you kind of more complex analysis. It compares the intensity and discrimination to your memories and what you know of the world, and kind of integrates the information a little bit more. The motor planning areas organize movements. That makes sense, right? They plan motor acts. The primary motor cortex provides selective motor control via the corticospinal tracts and the cortico-brainstem tracts. So all of the upper motor neurons live in the primary motor cortex. The association cortex is everything else, or besides those four things. And the association cortices control behavior, they interpret sensation, and they process emotions and memories. So, you know how I'm always saying you have to be exposed to some information, and then you have to take a break from it, and then re-expose yourself to the information in order to leave time for encoding of the information into long-term memory. Well, the association cortex is doing that encoding, processing the emotions and storing them in long-term memory. So that's why you can't cram right before a test and have the optimum results, because the association cortex needs time to do its thing. So each type of cortex can play a role in the response to a stimulus, and they all work together in order to organize the activity around that stimulus. So pretty cool, right? So here's the chart that I looked at the beginning of the quarter. We get sensory information coming in from the periphery, goes to the primary sensory cortex through the thalamus, and we get simple sensory discrimination. So the primary sensory cortex tells us the intensity and the quality of that sensory information that we're getting. The secondary sensory cortex provides recognition of that. The association cortices, even though it says cortex there, but there's more than one, it organizes information around goal selection, planning, monitoring, interpretation of sensations, emotions, memory processing. This is a lot of times what we think of as cognitive function, even though sensory and motor are involved in it as well. When the association cortices decide we need a movement, the information goes to the motor planning areas, and where the movement is composed and sequenced with information from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, and then it's sent out to the primary motor cortex for cortical motor output through the upper motor neurons. So the gray matter in the primary motor cortex is the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons that make up the corticospinal tracts. So there it is, all in one little nifty chart, right? Which is pretty cool that it does that. Obviously, this is simplified. There's a lot more input, but this is a nice little diagram to tell you how the parts are interacting. So the primary sensory area, we have primary sensory areas for all of our different senses. So we have ones for touch, ones for vision, ones for sound, or auditory cortices. So each primary sensory area is going to discriminate among different intensities and qualities of one type of input. So the example is the primary auditory area says like, oh, what's that? Oh, there's a sound. What is it? How loud is it? Where is it? Most of the primary sensory areas are located within and just adjacent to landmark cortical fissures. So if you look at the anatomy of the brain, and there's some great diagrams in this chapter, in chapter 27, which will look at where the different things are located. And I have some of them in the PowerPoint that you'll see. But the primary visual cortex is within the calcarine sulcus. I'm not going to expect you to know all the different sulci and everything, and on the adjacent gyrate. So that's where the primary visual cortex is in all of us. That's where it always is. And so that it's in its posterior in the occipital lobe. And so that's why when you have a posterior artery stroke, it affects your vision. because it affects that, the primary visual cortex. The primary vestibular cortex, which is getting that gravity information from the vestibular apparatus, is at the posterior end of the lateral fissure in the parieto-insular cortex. So the point of all this is not for you to know exactly where things are, but to know that they're always in the same place. They're the same place on me as they are on you, as they are on you, as they are on you. And the only time that they're different is if you have some kind of surgery or trauma or something that rearranges the stuff in your brain or some kind of pathology. So, but they're all in the same area. Kind of neat. So this is the chart that I was talking about that shows the somatosensory and the visual and the vestibular cortices and where they're located close to important structures in the brain. This is a great chart as well. And in the 6th edition, it's on page 483. In the 5th edition, it's in chapter 26, but it's the same chart. And it has listed the 4 cortical areas: primary somatosensory, primary auditory, primary visual, and primary vestibular. So those are kind of our 4 main primary sensory areas, what their function is, and then if there's a lesion on that area, what is the effect? So, for example, the primary somatosensory cortex discriminates size, texture, and shape of objects, and a lesion causes lack of tactile localization and conscious proprioception. So as you can imagine, that information is coming up the dorsal column medial lemniscus to the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex, just like we said earlier in the quarter. So if you have a lesion in anywhere along that path, it can cause that problem. But you can have completely intact pathways all the way up to the cerebral cortex. And if the cerebral cortex can't do it, nothing's going to happen. Or, you have a defect. The primary auditory cortex is conscious discrimination of loudness and pitch of sounds. And if you have a lesion in the primary auditory cortex, you can't localize sounds. You can't tell where a sound is coming from. As you can imagine, that could be pretty distracting if you can't tell where a sound is coming from. And we have, coordinating circuits that allow us to turn our head towards the sound. Even people who have visual impairments will automatically turn their head towards a sound. So it's a little bit about vision, but it's not all about vision. So really kind of interesting. The primary visual cortex distinguishes the intensity of light, the shape, size, and location of objects. If you have a lesion in one side or the other of the primary visual cortex, you will have homonymous hemianopia. So that's where you lose half of your visual field on each eye. So you can imagine if you had a stroke in that area, that's what it would cause. Middle cerebral artery strokes often affect this area. Primary vestibular cortex discriminates among head positions and head movements and contributes to the perception of vertical. So a lot of times the vestibular ocular reflex is going to adjust our head and eyes to make sure we're vertical. That's why you get seasickness, motion sickness, when you're not sure where vertical is, because you're getting weird sensations of disconnect between the visual and the vestibular when you're on a boat or on a moving surface. So if you have a lesion in the primary vestibular cortex, you're going to get, you can get dizziness, you can get problems with balance because you don't have that movement, head movement perception. Interesting, right? So when you lose discriminative sensory information because you have lesions in the primary sensory area, you lose the ability to discriminate the intensity and quality of stimuli. So it interferes with your capacity to use the sensations that are coming in from the periphery. If you have a unilateral lesion in the primary auditory cortex, it only interferes with the ability to localize sound. It doesn't interfere with the ability to actually hear. So it's kind of interesting. If you have a bilateral lesion, it might affect your ability to hear. The primary visual cortex lesions cause contralateral homonymous hemianopia. So if you have a right-sided visual cortex lesion, you're going to have a left visual field cut in both eyes. If you have a left visual cortex lesion, you're going to have a right visual field cut in both eyes. So that's just how it works. Perception is the interpretation of sensation into a meaningful form. So the primary sensory cortices don't really do this. They tell us what the intensity and the shape and the loudness and the intensity of light and that sort of thing and movement. But you need interaction among the different cortices, the brain, the body, and the environment. And it involves the memory of past experiences and motivation and expectations and selection of sensory information. So when you have attention deficit disorder, you have difficulty in selecting from all the sensory information that's being provided to you. You also need to have an active search for pertinent sensory information, like what's really going on. We need to get that information in order to get the perception right. So as you can imagine, perception is a sort of a malleable process. Things can change. So the secondary sensory areas analyze sensory input from both the thalamus and the primary sensory cortex. Cortices, all of them. They contribute to the analysis of one type of sensory information. So we have the primary auditory cortex, we have the secondary auditory cortex. We have the primary somatosensory cortex, we have the secondary somatosensory cortex. So each secondary area analyzes its type of information, not the other ones. So neurons in the second somatosensory area provide stereognosis by comparing somatosensation from current objects with memories of other objects. So that's what I was saying when we were talking about stereognosis in the somatosensory chapter, that if you were not able to see and you were palpating an object that you hadn't encountered before, you didn't have a memory of, you could probably describe the texture, the shape, and the size of the object, but you wouldn't be able to tell what it was because you don't have that memory. So this is the chart, and this is on page 485 in the 6th edition, and it's also in the 5th edition. I don't know the exact page, but it's in chapter 26 of the 5th edition. So the secondary somatosensory, it's in charge of taking those sensory things from the primary cortex, sensory inputs, and comparing them to the memory of tactile and spatial objects that we have encountered before. So if you have a lesion in the secondary somatosensory cortex, it causes a stereognosis. You could also have a stereognosis from a peripheral issue in the somatosensory system. So there are a lot of different things that could cause that loss of that particular function. But we're talking about the cerebrum, and so cerebral lesions in the secondary somatosensory cortex cause that. In the secondary visual cortex, we analyze motion, color, actually recognizing visual objects, understanding of visual spatial relationships, and controlling visual fixation. So when you have a lesion in the secondary visual cortex, you get visual agnosia or optic ataxia. So visual agnosia is you can see something, but you don't know what it is. I don't know what that is. Like, that's a thing. I don't know what it is. So you can see it. You have the ability to perceive it, but you can't click it together with memories of what it is. There is a really awesome book that's called My Stroke of Insight, and a brain scientist from the University of Washington had a stroke and recovered from it and wrote this book. And one of the things she talked about during her recovery is she was trying to build new sensory memories, things that she didn't remember before. And It's a great book if you ever get a chance to read it. And it's not like a technical read, it's an easy, engaging read. So My Stroke of Insight, if you get a chance to read that. She has a good TED Talk too. One of my friends, after listening to her TED Talk, said, "Wow, it makes me want to have a stroke." Not really, but there you go. And optic ataxia of course, is discoordination. So it's discoordination of vision. So if you have optic ataxia, it could cause double vision, right? Diplopia. So the secondary auditory cortex classifies sounds. So you hear a sound, you go, okay, I hear a sound and it's loud and it's over there. And you go, oh, wait, I recognize that sound. It's music. Like, oh, I like this song, and send a message to the motor cortex to turn it up so I can hear it. So if you have a lesion in the secondary auditory cortex, it can cause auditory agnosia, where you cannot recognize sounds. And that includes people's voices and that sort of thing. So there's a really nice one-to-one function of what an individual cortical area does and what lesions in that area cause. So I like it. It's organized. It makes sense. So agnosia is the general term for the ability to recognize objects when using a specific sense. And the subtypes are astereognosis, visual, and auditory agnosia. So basically what that means is when you have agnosia, it means you can perceive the sensory input, but you can't organize it, you can't categorize it, you can't use it, basically, because your secondary sensory areas are what do that categorizing and aligning it with what you already know. And so you can perceive the object, but you can't process what it is. So it's a processing error, if you want to think of it that way. So astereognosis, we talked about, it's the inability to identify objects by touch and manipulation, despite intact discriminative somatosensation. So the signal's getting there, you just can't process it. So a person with astereognosis would be able to describe the object being palpated, but not by touching or manipulating it. So they could say, like I had the little picture of the key here, they could say, it's small, it's pointy on one end and round on the other, feels pretty rigid, but they wouldn't be able to tell you what it was because the secondary somatosensory cortex cannot hook it up with your memories of what a key is. So visual agnosia, you can't recognize objects despite having intact vision. So a person with visual agnosia would be able to describe the size or shape of something, but they can't identify them visually. They don't know what they are. So you have the input, but you don't have the output, basically. And auditory agnosia, you can perceive sound, but you can't recognize it. So probably someone with auditory agnosia or destruction of the secondary auditory cortex would probably not enjoy music very much, I'm guessing. Interestingly enough, destruction of the right auditory cortex interferes with interpretation of environmental sounds. So we will see that as well when we start to get into other effects of lesions in different areas. We'll see where the right side affects one area and the left side affects another. So very interesting. We will talk about motor cortices in the next lecture.